Scientists were able to mimic Nesyamun's voice by recreating his mouth and vocal cords with a 3D printer. It allowed them to produce a single sound.
Long before modern civilization, a man in ancient Egypt spent his life speaking to the gods. When he died, his coffin begged for one thing, that his voice might live beyond death.
The ancient Egyptians required you to take responsibility for your life. And if you did not do so, the outcome after death would not be good.
3 millennia later, machines and algorithms have answered that call. Using medical imaging and artificial intelligence, scientists made his mummy speak.
And hard to bring a 3,000-year-old mummified priest's voice back to life. They used all the technology we have, and here is what it sounds like.
Wait, hold on.
But the moment his voice filled the room, every listener froze. It wasn't comfort they felt, it was chills. The mummy whose voice refused to die. In the early 1820s, tucked quietly among the cargo of a Europe-bound shipment, there was something extraordinary: a sealed Egyptian coffin from Thebes. It wasn't part of a grand expedition or a royal collection. It was just one more antiquity headed west at a time when Egypt's past was being traded piece by piece. In 1823, the coffin and its mummy were purchased in London, and within a year, the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society had taken ownership. In 1824, they opened it. There was no fanfare, no cameras, no tourists, just a small team of local surgeons and a chemist examining the body. They published their findings 4 years later, in 1828, producing one of the earliest scientific reports ever written on an Egyptian mummy. Then came the night the city nearly lost him. In March 1941, the Second World War reached Leeds. The air raid that night was brutal. A high-explosive bomb struck the museum directly, tearing through its galleries and reducing centuries of history to debris. 2 Egyptian mummies were destroyed completely, but this one, the man later known as Nesyamun, somehow survived. The staff had moved him to another room and placed him in a newer case just before the bombing, an act that likely saved both his coffin and his body. Because he stayed in one place for 200 years, his body kept attracting the attention of doctors, archaeologists, and later, imaging specialists. Each generation added another layer of knowledge, documenting every mark, every bone, every inch of preserved skin. That chain of care built something rare in the museum world, a full scientific biography. So why was this mummy the one chosen for something as strange as a voice reconstruction? The answer comes down to anatomy. When scientists re-examined his remains, they found that a good portion of his throat, the passages above the larynx, behind the tongue, and through the mouth, had kept its shape. Not its living tissue, of course. Mummification dries and hardens soft organs until they become little more than thin, leathery layers. But the pathway, the hollow shape air would have taken from lungs to lips, was still there. The major losses were expected. The soft palate, the flap at the back of the roof of your mouth, was gone, and most of the tongue's mass had collapsed. But the main airway, that central channel through which sound would normally travel, had survived. That's an astonishing detail, because it meant there was still a tube that could, in theory, resonate sound. To understand what that means, think of your throat and mouth as a musical instrument. Your vocal cords, 2 thin folds deep in the larynx, act like the reed in a woodwind. The air you push past them vibrates. That vibration travels through your throat, mouth, and nasal passages, your resonance chamber. And the shape of that chamber determines what the sound becomes. Every vowel you make depends on how you reshape that chamber by moving your tongue, lips, and soft palate. Because the shape of the Nesyamun throat and mouth was still there, it could be measured, modeled, and made to resonate artificially. Scientists realized that if they could digitally copy the exact geometry of his airway, they could send a synthetic buzz through it and hear the resulting tone. If that worked, it would mean more than recreating a single sound. It could reveal how an ancient Egyptian voice physically resonated, how tone and speech might have sounded inside temple halls, and how much anatomy alone can tell us about a person's real voice thousands of years later. But before diving into that experiment, it helps to meet the man himself. Nesyamun had lived in Thebes, modern-day Luxor, during the waning years of Egypt's 20th dynasty, more than 11 centuries BCE. It was a time of political unrest, with power shifting between pharaohs, priests, and local governors. But inside the great temples of Karnak, life followed an ancient rhythm. Nesyamun worked there as a temple priest and scribe, roles that required precision, ritual purity, and, most importantly, a strong voice. He wasn't a soldier or a builder. He was a temple professional, someone who spoke sacred words for a living. His official titles included scribe who lays out offerings, scribe who keeps tally, and God's father of Montu, referring to Montu, the Theban god of war. These weren't silent jobs. Each required clear, controlled speech, reading ritual lists, chanting invocations, calling out to deities, and reciting hymns that marked the temple calendar. Every day at Karnak, voices filled the courtyards as priests performed offerings at sunrise, midday, and sunset. For Nesyamun, his voice was his profession. And that's what makes his story so hauntingly poetic. Thousands of years after he last spoke, scientists would use his preserved throat to reproduce a sound that, in a small way, returned his voice to the world. In ancient Egypt, speech carried deep spiritual weight. The words ma-keru, meaning true of voice, or justified, were carved after the names of the dead who had passed moral judgment in the afterlife. To be true of voice meant more than honesty. It meant harmony with divine order. Tomb inscriptions often included prayers that the deceased might continue to speak with the gods in the afterlife. Nesyamun's coffin carries that same wish. It asks that he might see and address the gods as he once did in life. When you put all that together, a man whose work was ritual speech, whose coffin prays for voice beyond death, and whose throat happened to survive, the modern experiment stops feeling like a stunt. It feels like the most respectful way possible to fulfill his own request. Now, back to the physical side. When the Leeds team conducted detailed scans, they found that after 3 millennia, 2 key distances inside his throat could still be measured precisely. From his upper lip to the hard palate, the bony front part of the roof of the mouth was about 3 1/5 inches. From the thyroid notch, near the Adam's apple, up to that same palate line was about 2 2/3 inches. For comparison, 2 modern adult males measured alongside him had slightly longer dimensions in both ranges. That small difference matters acoustically. A shorter airway produces a higher, brighter tone, while a longer one yields a deeper, darker sound. There's another reason the Leeds mummy became so valuable to science. Because the museum had held him for so long, it had detailed notes from every previous examination. The original 19th century unwrapping described the layers of linen, the floral garlands, and even a leather face mask decorated with tiny images of gods and the cartouches of Ramesses XI. Those cartouches, name rings showing the pharaoh's identity, confirmed exactly when Nesyamun had lived and linked him directly to the late 20th dynasty. That level of documentation made his case unusually solid. His lifetime, location, and occupation all lined up perfectly. The records also describe how he was prepared for eternity. You can picture the embalmers in their workshop, the smell of resin, the careful wrapping of linen bandages, the final ornament placed over his face, a leather panel embossed with protective deities and royal symbols. Every layer was meant to protect his body and preserve his ability to speak in the afterlife. His burial place matched his profession. Nesyamun was laid to rest among fellow temple priests and priestesses near the causeway of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, one of the most sacred sites on Thebes' West Bank. So now that we know who he was and why his voice mattered, here's how researchers turned his fragile anatomy into sound. How scientists made Nesyamun speak. They started in a hospital, using the same kind of machine that scans living patients. The mummy was carefully brought into the radiology department at Leeds General Infirmary. There, he was placed into a Siemens definition multi-detector CT scanner, a medical-grade system that captures incredibly detailed images of the inside of a human body. The researchers ran what's called a helical scan, where the scanner rotates continuously as the table moves, creating a spiral path of X-rays through the body. They set it to very fine resolution. Each image slice was just 0.024 inches thick. That level of detail mattered because the part of the body they cared about most, the airway from the voice box up to the lips, isn't a straight tube. It curves, narrows, and bends in subtle ways. If the image slices were too thick, those curves would blur into one another. Thin slices, by contrast, keep every turn sharp. The team scanned the entire body from head to toe, but they also ran a second, higher resolution scan focused just on the head and neck. The idea was to zoom in and capture the fine details of the throat, tongue base, and mouth cavity with as much clarity as possible. When the scanning was complete, the data was saved as uncompressed DICOM files, the gold standard medical image format that preserves every pixel without compression artifacts. These are the same files radiologists use in hospitals, meaning that every detail, from the faintest tissue edge to the exact dimensions of the airway, stayed intact for later reconstruction. Once they had the data set, the real work began, extracting the air column inside the mummy's throat and mouth. That air column, the hollow space that once carried his voice, is the heart of this entire experiment. In a CT image, air shows up as pure black, while bone and tissue appear in shades of gray and white. The team loaded the dataset into ITK Snap, a medical imaging program that allows scientists to segment 3D structures. Think of segmentation like tracing an outline, one image slice at a time. The researchers placed small seed points inside the black region that represented air. Then the software automatically grew that region outward, filling in the space until it met solid tissue, the inner walls of the airway. It was careful, repetitive work. If the algorithm wandered too far or missed a corner, the shape of the final airway would be distorted, and that would throw off the acoustics. Once the automatic tracing was done, the researchers checked every frame by eye, hundreds of cross-sectional slices, adjusting and redrawing where needed. Some areas required special attention. The soft palate, the flap at the back of the mouth that helps humans pronounce different sounds, was missing in the mummy. They had to estimate where it would have been to close off the nasal passage and complete the mouth cavity. Without this step, air in the digital model would leak through the nasal root, changing the sound entirely. When the airway was cleanly isolated, they surrounded it with a thin virtual wall, like giving the invisible air tube a plastic shell, so that it could later be 3D printed as a physical object. They also added a connector at the bottom, an opening where a loudspeaker could attach to pump sound through the model. With the digital airway complete, they sent the file to a Connex 263D printer. This printer has an accuracy of about 200 microns, or 0.008 inches, fine enough to reproduce even tiny features of the throat's curvature. The accuracy wasn't a luxury, it was the whole point. In speech, the sound of a voice depends on millimeter-scale differences in the airway's shape. A fraction of an inch too wide or too narrow, and the tone changes. The printed replica had to capture every ridge and bend of Nesyamun's ancient anatomy. The 3D print wasn't the source of sound, it was the filter. As we explained earlier, sound begins with the vocal folds in the larynx, which vibrate as air passes through them. That vibration produces a buzz. The buzz travels upward through the throat and mouth, and the shape of that passage turns the sound into recognizable vowels. Since Nesyamun's vocal folds were long gone, the scientists needed an artificial equivalent, a way to create the buzz that his throat could then filter. For that, they used a device called the vocal tract organ, developed for acoustic experiments. It produces a synthetic larynx signal based on a standard speech model known as the Lillienkrantz-Fant model. In simple terms, it's a controllable electronic buzz that behaves like a real human voice box. You can set the pitch, adjust the loudness, and even add a touch of vibrato to make it sound more lifelike. The team mounted the 3D printed airway on a tight-fitting coupler connected to the speaker output of an Adastra 952210 loudspeaker, rated at 16 ohms and 60 watts. This ensured that all the sound energy from the artificial larynx traveled up through the printed throat with no leaks. On the other end, the mouth of the model, they placed a high-quality microphone to record the output. Before analyzing the result, it helps to understand one acoustic term: formants. These are peaks in the frequency spectrum caused by the shape of the vocal tract. The easiest way to imagine it is to think of blowing across the top of a bottle. The sound you get depends on the bottle's shape and size. Your throat and mouth work the same way. As air vibrates through them, certain frequencies are amplified more than others. Those amplified frequencies, called formants, determine what vowel you hear. Each human voice has several main formants, usually labeled F1, F2, F3, and F4. When you move your tongue or lips, you change the spacing of these formants, and that's how we switch from ah to e to oo. The leads team couldn't make Nesyamun's airway move, but they could identify where his static formants fell, and from that, determine what single vowel-like sound his preserved throat would naturally produce. When they ran the test, the result was clear and eerie. A short, steady vowel-like tone emerged, something between the vowels in bed and bad. To verify, they compared the spectral peaks of the mummy's output with recordings from 6 living adult males pronouncing those same vowels. The first and third formant peaks matched closely. The second and fourth were offset, but that's expected. No two throats are identical, and Nesyamun's airway was frozen in a posture chosen for burial, not for speech. They added a slight downward pitch glide, a subtle fall in tone, to make the sound feel more natural. In real human speech, pitch almost never stays perfectly flat. Our voices rise and fall slightly, even on steady vowels. The team wanted the playback to sound less like a laboratory beep and more like a breath of human tone. What they did not claim is just as important as what they did. They never said they had made the mummy speak. They made it clear that what they produced was a single sound, not a word or sentence. The airway is like a statue. It has one fixed shape. In life, the tongue, lips, and palate move constantly to change that shape and form speech. Nesyamun's preserved airway could no longer move, so it could only yield one sound, the resonance of that one frozen configuration. You might ask why they went through the trouble of printing the airway instead of just simulating it on a computer. The answer is both practical and intuitive. A physical model gives you immediate feedback. You can run a sound through it and hear the result instantly. It's also easier to test small changes physically, like adjusting the connector size or the wall thickness, and hear how each tweak alters the sound. Software models can do the same in theory, but a printed tract brings the experiment into the real world, where air actually moves and resonates. That said, the researchers also pointed to a future digital version, a waveguide model, where you simulate airflow and resonance purely through equations. That kind of model could one day animate a digital version of the tract, letting it change shape over time to form words. But for this first attempt, the physical print offered something you can hold, test, and verify with microphones and ears. This project wasn't born out of nowhere. A few years earlier, in 2016, an Italian team had scanned the natural mummy known as Ötzi, the Iceman, to model what his vowels might have sounded like. They did this to prove that the CT geometry of a vocal tract, even after millennia, could reveal the natural resonance patterns that shape a person's voice, laying the groundwork for the method later used on Nesyamun. That single tone was all Nesyamun's throat could give on its own. But to make him truly speak again, scientists had to bring in AI. The moment AI takes over the mummy experiment. Right now, we have a starting point that no one in history has ever had. A measured filter, a full three-dimensional map of a human airway frozen in time. What's missing is motion. In life, our throats are never still. The tongue slides forward and back, the jaw drops and lifts, the lips stretch or round, and the soft palate opens or closes to shape air into words. That constant dance of muscles turns a simple buzz from the vocal cords into the sound of speech. Right now, Nesyamun's tract can only do one thing: produce the sound of air moving through its fixed shape. That's why the original experiment gave us one short, stable, vowel-like tone. A sound that sits between bed and bad. It's real, it's physical, but it's also locked in one moment. The next step is finding a way to bring back motion without ever touching the remains, by combining physics, which governs how air vibrates in a tube, with AI, which can learn how those shapes normally move in time. The physics part is already solved. Machine learning systems are remarkably good at finding smooth, natural control patterns. Those flowing curves that describe how fast the tongue moves, how wide the mouth opens, and how the lips round from sound to sound. It's the same principle behind today's realistic text-to-speech voices in phones, smart speakers, and audiobooks. Those systems don't just make random noise. They predict the precise timing and melody of each phrase, a property called prosody. The difference here is that instead of generating sound directly, we want AI to control motion inside a measured space. The digital copy of Nesyamun's airway. Think of it as training AI not to speak words in the normal sense, but to steer air through a shape that already exists. In modern text-to-speech systems, AI models such as Tachotron learn how to turn text into a map of sound energy called a spectrogram. Another neural network, called a vocoder, then transforms that map into actual audio. These models are powerful because they learn rhythm, timing, and tone automatically from thousands of hours of recorded speech. For Nesyamun, we wouldn't feed the AI text. Instead, we'd train it on the motions that produce sound. Over the past decade, research labs have built enormous public datasets of people speaking while inside MRI scanners. These recordings show the moving tongue, jaw, and soft palate in real time, synchronized perfectly with the sound being produced. You can literally watch the vocal tract change shape for each vowel and consonant as the sound plays. Those MRI datasets, collected at universities like USC and Western Sydney, are gold for a project like this. They teach AI how movement relates to sound, and vice versa. From them, AI can learn two key things: how a specific motion of the tongue, jaw, and palate produces a certain sound, and how to infer, from hearing a sound, what the most likely movements were that produced it. That second part, called acoustic inversion, is especially important. If the AI learns that a particular vowel or consonant normally corresponds to a specific tongue posture or mouth shape, it can make educated guesses for someone whose soft tissues no longer exist. Those guesses aren't random. They're guided by the data of living speakers and by the hard boundaries we already have from Nesyamun's scanned skull and airway. Imagine having a digital version of Nesyamun's throat, a three-dimensional model that's anatomically accurate where it was preserved and statistically reconstructed where it wasn't. Now, using AI, we can simulate what happens when that model moves. Deep neural networks trained on MRI speech data can generate smooth sequences of shapes, describing how the tongue and jaw shift for each sound in a word. Early versions of this idea used simpler mathematical models that were slow and clunky. Today's deep learning versions, especially those based on recurrent neural networks like LSTMs, can handle the continuous flow of motion, predicting one shape after another in real time. We don't need perfection for Nesyamun, only something physically reasonable. The goal isn't to guess what his tongue looked like down to the millimeter, but to simulate movement that stays within human norms and never breaks the anatomical limits of his preserved structure. I can learn those patterns from modern humans, then adapt them to fit the smaller or differently curved airway that the CT scan revealed. This takes us from a single, frozen tube to a sequence of tubes, frames in motion, each slightly reshaped by learned control signals that mimic how a human mouth really moves through time. Now we need the source of the sound itself, the vibration that the moving tract will shape. In living people, that comes from the vocal folds, two small bands of tissue in the larynx that open and close hundreds of times per second. In AI speech synthesis, that buzz is often modeled using what's called a neural source filter system. The AI generates both parts, a synthetic version of the glottal buzz, the source, and a set of parameters describing the resonating tract, the filter. In this case, we already have the real filter, Nesyamun's measured airway, and AI can provide a realistic source. Neural vocoders like WaveNet or Hi-Fi GAN can generate a clean, natural buzz that matches human pitch and breath patterns. By feeding that signal through the time-varying model of his tract, we get sound that's true to his physical shape, not a generic human one. The AI can even control pitch directly, allowing for natural rise and fall in tone. Those pitch curves, called fundamental frequency trajectories, carry emotion, rhythm, and the flow of speech. Together, the learned source and the measured filter form a system that behaves much like a living voice. Air vibration from below, shaped by moving anatomy above. Back in 2020, the Leeds team hinted at this next step. They mentioned using digital waveguides, a physics-based method for simulating how sound travels through tubes. A waveguide model splits the airway into many small segments, each representing a tiny slice of the passage. The computer calculates how sound waves bounce, merge, and lose energy as they move through those segments. It's been used for decades in synthesizing musical instruments, from flutes to brass. In our case, it becomes a stage where the AI's learn motions play out. Frame by frame, the digital throat changes shape. The waveguide simulation calculates how those changes alter the resonances, the formants, and produces continuous sound. It's not a black box AI voice, it's a real physical simulation guided by neural control. That's how you play a digital version of Nesyamun's airway. AI generates plausible muscle movements, physics computes the acoustics, and the result is a sound that evolves naturally over time, shaped by the same geometry that was scanned from his body. That leads to the next question. What language would he speak? Ancient Egyptian texts, especially before the Coptic period, usually record only consonants. Vowels were often left out, just as ancient Hebrew and Arabic scripts once did. Modern scholars reconstruct vowels by comparing Coptic, which writes vowels using Greek letters, and by analyzing how Egyptian words were transcribed into Greek or other languages. For example, if a word appears in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and in a Greek historian's record, the Greek version gives clues to the missing vowels. But these are educated reconstructions, not certainties. Put it all together, and the process becomes clear. First, digitize the airway that was already scanned in Leeds and convert it into a detailed three-dimensional model that can flex and morph. Then reconstruct the missing soft tissues, the tongue and palate, by fitting statistical templates from real human MRI datasets to his skull geometry. Next, choose a short set of words or phrases, actually written in his own inscriptions, like lines from his coffin prayers, and generate a few possible vowelizations for each, based on Egyptological reconstructions. After that, generate motion with AI, using trained models to produce realistic time-varying shapes of the vocal tract for each sound, but limit those motions to what would physically fit inside his measured anatomy. Then simulate sound with digital waveguides, feeding a synthetic larynx buzz through the changing shapes, render the audio, and analyze it, confirming that the resulting resonances stay consistent with known human speech patterns and with the fixed dimensions of his throat. The outcome would be short phrases, seconds long, not minutes, that sound like a human voice filtered by Nesyamun's physical anatomy. Every parameter, motion range, pitch, and vowel pattern, would be labeled transparently so listeners know where the data ends and the reconstruction begins. It's important to remember what even the best AI can and can't do here. Modern text-to-speech models sound human because they're trained on vast audio corpora, sometimes hundreds of hours long. They learn language, emotion, rhythm, all from data. Nesyamun has no recordings. His language has limited phonetic documentation. If we trained an AI end-to-end, it would simply mimic modern English or Arabic, washing out everything that makes his case unique. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.